Check, check, 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Good afternoon. Welcome to each of you. I am Charlotte Williams. I am Professor of Public Health and Director of the Clinton School Center on Community Philanthropy. Our Center on Community Philanthropy is a specialized unit within the Clinton School. It's dedicated to teaching, researching, writing, publishing, and practicing community philanthropy as a strategy for delivering public service. You know, from the very beginning of the Clinton School, a focus on philanthropy was always intended as a unique aspect of particularly global public service. The reason for that is that if giving of your life and your career for the betterment of mankind is the generic way we define public service, then once you start adding your wealth and your resources to that, it takes it to a whole nother level. Also, these southern states, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, were considered some of the poorest states in the country, but every year we rank at or near the top in charitable giving by the Internal Revenue Service. So we knew that we needed an adjective in front of the word philanthropy so people would not think we're talking about the rich giving to the poor. So this community philanthropy, it connotes that giving is a natural part of communal living, and it's a vital but poorly understood aspect of public service. So here at the Clinton School, we are exploring philanthropy in its broadest, most expansive, inclusive way. We're studying it as benevolence in a community-centered, consensus-building approach to delivering public service. We're studying giving as a joining with others to address some of our basic humanitarian interests, like reducing generational poverty, improving access to quality pre-K education, understanding race in media, and to do this with a community-based, participatory, active process. And today we have something different. Dr. Adam is going to talk to us about his book, American Philanthropy in the Global Context. And here to introduce him and to talk a bit about how we're going to facilitate the conversation is our Dean, Victoria DiFrancesco Soto. Since Dean Soto has taken over the lead of the Clinton School, she brings great energy and strong vision for our philanthropy and public service. Dean Soto challenges me and our team and our students to scale up and to think more deeply about your commitment in philanthropy and public service. In fact, our dean really led efforts to make certain that our community philanthropy was not just talked about or read about, but it was seen. She created the brick and mortar places to include intentional spaces for our students, for our partners, our national funders to come to the Center on Community Philanthropy, to convene here, to do a residency here, where you can really immerse yourselves in things related to community philanthropy and public service. And with that, I'd like to introduce our dean, Dr. Victoria DiFrancesco Soto.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I had the pleasure of first meeting Dr. Thomas Adam a couple of months ago on a trip up to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And I was meeting with several political science faculty, and we're just chit-chatting. And he's like, oh, yeah, I've got a new book coming out. I was like, oh, really, what is it? He's like, well, it's American Philanthropy in Global Context. I'm like, well, you know, philanthropy is at the core of what we study and research and focus on at the Clinton School. So you're coming. We're going to figure out a way for you to come down to Little Rock. By the way, this is Dr. Adams' first time in Little Rock, so we made good on the promise. Because I think it is so important to, as we think about public service, which is multi-sectorial, public service is something that happens in the public sector, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, and in the philanthropic sector. So to really have a grounding in all of those avenues for impact. So what we are in for today is a brief overview of Dr. Adams' book, hot off the press. I highly suggest you check it out. It's not a beach read, I'm gonna be honest, but it is such a deep and engaging read for this topic, so I highly recommend it. And then afterwards, I'll do a brief moderated conversation, but then I want to leave the majority of the time for Q&A, for a discussion with our community members, our students, our faculty, and staff. So with that, let me welcome to the podium Dr. Thomas Adam. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for this invitation to see Little Rock, which I really see for the first time. So, American philanthropy in the global context, which covers about the last 300 years, and I will try to do this in 10 minutes. So I will have some things which I don't mention, so feel free to ask about anything you want after these 10 minutes, and I try to keep within the 10 minutes. This is a history of American philanthropy in the global context, and just to be sure that it is clear what this is about, let me explain what I mean by global context. I'm not a historian of American history. I'm a historian who is a global historian. I look at phenomena which exist in different countries, different regions, different religions, different cultures, and I focus on that phenomenon, and I think it is best to think about philanthropy as if it is a tree which has deep roots in human history, which go back to the beginnings of society and then develops branches and grows into different regions, into specific countries, into specific religions, and into specific cultures. And these branches have different colors, different flowers, different leaves. They are trimmed back from time to time because society, culture, and the state doesn't like what philanthropy does, but it develops out of this one common tradition. And then it is interesting to compare these different branches and to see how do they develop in different contexts, in different religions, in different cultures, societies. What do they have in common? What is distinguished about them? So when I look at this branch of American philanthropy, let me focus on 3 points. 3 points from the book, which we can discuss in greater detail. So I will just give a general view here. So the first point is about recognizing that American philanthropy did not develop in isolation and not out of thin air, but that American philanthropy is based upon traditions, is based upon institutions which have existed long before the United States was born as a country. The book is based on an approach which focuses on institutions, and the 3 most important institutions when it comes to philanthropy from a historical point of view are the endowment, the foundation, and the association. And these 3 institutions existed long before European settlers made the way across the Atlantic to what later became the United States. The oldest of these 3 institutions is the endowment, and the endowment is the endowment understood as a donation which creates a fund which is entrusted to an existing legal body which is already in existence. The endowment has the longest historical tradition in Western Europe within Christianity. It goes back to the late Roman Empire, dominated the Middle Ages, and developed for almost a millennium before the founding of the United States. The foundation is a little bit more complicated because it has no basis within Christianity. The foundation actually comes out of the Islamic world, out of the Mediterranean world. The very first Christian foundation we know was founded in 1264, Merton College at Oxford University, and that foundation was based upon Islamic precedent, not institutions created within Christianity. And the association as institution has also no basis within the Christian world of Europe, but within the Jewish world. So this is the contribution of Judaism to our modern system of philanthropy. The very first association was created in 1564 in the city of Prague within the Jewish community, and it begins with associations which are dedicated to burial services, but very soon to the provision of healthcare. So American philanthropy is basically based upon European and Mediterranean precedents, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic precedents. And this comes to the United States and provides what we know, what we understand today as American philanthropy. The only true American innovation, I hope I don't make myself any enemies here, the only true the only truly American innovation. There are basically two, is the grant-making foundation and the idea that foundations should have a limited lifespan. The very first grant-making foundation, a foundation which doesn't take ownership of a problem or a solution, but which hands out grants to other entities which will do that. The very first grant-making foundation was not, as many believe, Rockefeller's General Education Board, but the Peabody Education Board, which was founded in 1867. And this grant-making foundation came with a second idea, that foundations should have a limited lifespan. Peabody imposed upon his education fund that it should exist only for 30 years. After 30 years, it should be dissolved because he considered the job of that institution done at that point. It was Julius Rosenwald who in 1917 created the Rosenwald Fund, who basically took on this idea, and in contrast to Peabody, who rarely spoke about what he did, started a public relations campaign and tried to convince donors to accept that model, because he strongly believed two things. One is that every social and cultural phenomenon is ephemeral, will exist only for a short amount of time in historical perspective. So when I say short amount of time, I'm talking about 3, 4, 5 decades, so don't get me wrong. But Rosenwald insisted that donors cannot know how society and how economy, how politics will work 100 years from now. Why should we then create an institution which will be there for eternity? So Rosenwald tried, in the middle of this wave of big foundation creation in the United States, Rockefeller, Carnegie, all of these things occur on this time, and Rosenwald was deeply concerned that this would go the wrong way. He tried to convince his fellow donors, consider foundations which have a lifespan of a maximum of 40 years. That is a very interesting idea which never made it to any other country. Nowhere across Europe was there ever a discussion that we should think about foundations with a limited lifespan. So both the grant-making foundation as well as the idea that foundations should have a limited lifespan are uniquely American. And Rosenwald focused or used 2 examples to make his point. So he was strongly of the opinion that foundations will lose their relevance. And he always pointed to this foundation of the Hershey Trust in Hershey, Pennsylvania. For those who are familiar with that, or for those who are not familiar, this is basically the foundation was supposed to be an orphanage. This foundation was endowed with $60 million in 1909, at a time where Americans, where educators, where psychologists started to believe that orphanages might not be such a good idea, and it is much better to raise orphans in foster families. Hershey was not deterred by this assumption, created that foundation. The trust is still around today, and the trust is worth today about, the last number I have seen is $17 billion. $60 million to $17 billion. The reason that this endowment has grown so much is that the foundation cannot spend the money they get from their investment in the capital market, because they have to support an orphanage. So how many orphanages do we still have in the United States? So the Hershey Trust has basically devolved into what critics would call a private school for about 1,100 students. The term orphan has been redefined. What was once orphan does now include, for instance, since 1976, social orphans. In other words, children who grew up in families where the parents are divorced or other circumstances. The Hershey Trust spends about, what was the number, $98,000 on every child entrusted to them, and they still have a surplus of $850 million each year. That's exactly what Rosenwald was afraid of, that there's a foundation created for a purpose. That purpose is no longer recognized in society, or the purpose changes, or our views about how to address that purpose change, and then we are stuck with a foundation which is created for eternity, and it is near to impossible to change the mission of that foundation. The second example is the La Verne-Noyes Trust, which was created in 1919 by a Chicago businessman with an amount of $1.3 million or so. This is the business which built all these windmills for the Midwest, which helped bringing up water supply. And he created in 1919 a foundation which was supposed to provide scholarships for students who attended college and who had served in the American Army during World War I. And when the foundation was created, he gave it a deed of trust which was extremely progressive, because he insisted that scholarships should be given either to soldiers who had served in the war or descendants from these soldiers, regardless of sex, race, religion, or political party. For that time, 1919, that's extremely progressive. The trust in a different version is still around today, with the same mission. It gives scholarships to students who can prove that they have a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who served in World War I, and again, the conditions are regardless of sex, race, religion, or political party. However, American society has changed quite a lot since 1919, especially with regards to the social composition, not to the social, but the geographic composition of American society. About 1/4 of all Americans came to this country after 1919. And most of them not from Europe or other regions, but from Asia, because they don't have a great-great-great-grandfather serving in World War I on the American side. They are automatically excluded from ever receiving a scholarship from that foundation. This is exactly what Rosenwald was also concerned about, that the most progressive foundation at the time can turn into its opposite. Because that foundation now, even though it specifies that it is regardless of sex, race, religion, and political party, still gives an advantage to Americans who can trace back their origin to European ancestry, because it is them who came to this country before 1919. Julius Rosenwald's concerns were largely unheard, because what Rosenwald ignored is that donors are motivated by the desire to be remembered, and by the desire to be remembered in a very specific way. That mattered especially to Rockefeller, that they be remembered for doing something good, not something bad. Being remembered for a period of 40 years doesn't really drive with that. So most of the foundations created when Rosenwald campaigned for limiting the lifespan were of course created for eternity, and that leads to a lot of trouble which we face today. American philanthropy's most distinguishing features are its global orientation, its religious footing, and that it exists by comparison in a society, in a political climate in which the state is, let me exaggerate a little bit, quite hostile to philanthropy. And that's a tradition in the United States. Let me talk about these three things. American philanthropy, American donations, American institutions of philanthropy differ from any comparable institutions across the European continent, that they have a global audience. It's not just Rockefeller with this statement that this foundation is created for the betterment of all mankind. It already started in 1816 with the American Bible Society, which in its mission statement made clear that this is not an association which serves only Americans, but which tries to serve on a global scale. And that is very unique. You will not find something like that in any institution across continental Europe. England, maybe one or two, but even there, this global orientation was simply not there. It was a much more national orientation. American philanthropy differs from European philanthropy in its religious setting and religious basing, and that has something to do with the constitutional separation of state and church, which drove philanthropy into the space of religion, because having lost state funding required churches or formerly established churches to find a new fundraising tool, and philanthropy came in handy. That put in the 19th century philanthropy in the service of the churches so much that politicians, critics could no longer see a distinction between religion and philanthropy, which also leads, in the American case, to the introduction of laws which limited the amount of money individual donors could give to philanthropic institutions, because that was if that would have been uncontrollable, then that was seen as basically providing the churches, established churches, a way back into society, into a dominating role in society. In states like Pennsylvania, in states like New York, donors were restricted to give not more than 50% of their estate to any philanthropic institution. And these laws limited the growth of philanthropy in the 19th century. That's fundamentally different from European countries which do not know a separation of state and church, and that meant in these countries, as in the case for Germany, for instance, that philanthropy was not identified with religion, was not driven into the space of religion, and could secularize much earlier than American philanthropy. In general, and this already came from these laws limiting the transfer of money from donors into the sphere of philanthropy, such limiting laws did not exist anywhere else. But that also hints at this problematic relationship, this problematic position of philanthropy within American society. In the 19th century, it's these restrictive laws. In the 20th century, we have three major congressional investigations: the Walsh Commission, the Reese and Cox Commission, and then Patman. The first one described philanthropy as the work of industrial dictators. The second one described the work of philanthropy as the work of communists. And the third one described philanthropy as the work of tax cheats. So in no other country did you have so much attention by the government, by the state, by politicians to philanthropy. In no other country have you so much criticism of philanthropy, and in no other country have you attempts to limit philanthropy to the degree as it happened in the United States. Let me stop here.
You left us on a cliffhanger. All right. I have so many questions. I'm going to focus on two big picture ones and then open it up. But the idea of formation and perpetuity is really intriguing, because as an American, it's something I always took for granted. I mean, that is how foundations work. But with what you discussed and Rosenblatt's views, you really put the microscope on the issue, and more than that, saying, is it all positive? Is having this organization with an illimitable durability really such a good idea? So if you could tease out maybe the pros and cons list of that, and then regardless of where we end up on the pros and cons list, what a sunset provision would look like. So a billionaire comes to you and says, Dr. Adam, I want to follow in Rosenblatt's footsteps. I want to establish this foundation, but only for 50 years. How do you maximize the impact, but then sunset it down? That was a very long question.
Let me try without the mic. So the question is always that if you set, this is a very practical one, if you set a lifespan of 30 or 40 years, you really have a hard time downspending, especially if we talk about these enormous amounts of money. Rockefeller had the same problem with the General Education Board. Others, the MES fund was initially also intended to be limited to 4 years, but then there was again so much money left over, so it had to be invested in a way which still works with what the donor wanted, but unfortunately turned into a perpetual. This notion of eternity or perpetual is very intriguing because in the 20th century it's not just foundations and endowments which are perpetual, but also associations, healthcare associations, secular healthcare associations, like the association which was originally created for fighting polio. The March of Dimes is the big issue. That was intended to be an association with a lifespan determined by how long it took to fight and to overcome polio. Victory was achieved, and the association transformed itself to be dedicated to something else. So even in the course of the 20th century, even associations which were intended to be, to use that nice word, ephemeral, became eternal. So there is a drive within philanthropy towards this eternity, and that is a problem. Because in a young country like the United States, again, by comparison to European countries where we have foundations which are 600, 700, 800 years old, a goal which was worthy 800 years ago might not be of great advantage 800 years later. And what do you do at that? What do you do at that? So there is a need to find a way to either limit the lifespan or to make it possible to modify the purpose of the foundation. And that, within the American legal system, where we have this suppressed government, is extremely common and almost always goes wrong because it's in the hands of lawyers or in the hands of historians. So. On the other hand, to convince a donor to create an institution for the duration of 30 or 40 years is not really a sales point, because I'm convinced that the primary motive of big donors is to be remembered. You promise them you will be remembered for 30 to 40 years instead of 500, 600 years. What do you think will happen? So it's a conundrum. If there is any kind of political position, meaning that we limit in general the lifespan of foundations, that will bring down the willingness of donors to donate. If we don't do it, we end up with things like the Hershey Trust, and the Hershey Trust is just one example. Other institutions, Girard College in Philadelphia has similar problems. They have more money than they can spend. Then we end up with institutions which accumulate that much money and have no way to spend it. And both are not ideal solutions.
That's not a bad problem. All right, I want to zoom out, and I want to think about the current moment we're in and situate the role of philanthropic organizations. So as we know, with the current administration, there has been a cutback to the role of federal government. However, the needs of individuals, kids are still hungry, there are still environmental challenges, they don't change, but how they are addressed changes. More action from the state governments, from the local governments, from private sector, from philanthropy. So in this moment, how do you see the role of philanthropy in the United States?
It's always good to have a historical perspective and to have a global perspective, because this isn't the first time that this happens. 1980s, 1990s across Europe, whether it is the United Kingdom, whether it is Germany or any of these countries, in this first phase of neoliberalism did exactly this, cutting whatever the state up until that point supported, and calling upon civil society, philanthropy at that time to step in. And then the public and politicians started criticizing, why isn't philanthropy fulfilling all of these things? We left you this space. And this is where philanthropy or non-profits, whatever we would like, whatever term we would like to use, is always criticized for something they cannot do. They are not equipped to fully battle something which the state did before or the state should do. It is not a reasonable expectation that philanthropy can fill the void left by the state. It never has. And to measure philanthropy, whether it can do so, is, as I know there's a tradition among some non-profit scholars to do that, it is simply misleading because philanthropy cannot be expected.
I want to open it up to the audience, but my last question before I do so, I know that at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, you teach a class on philanthropy, and for your students, what is the most important take-home that when the semester wraps up and they have left you, what do you want to know that they acquired in your class? It's that time of the semester.
At the beginning of the semester, not a single student can give me a very simple definition of what a foundation is, which is really fascinating. I was born in Germany, came to the United States about close to 3 decades ago, and in Germany you grew up with this idea that America is this beacon of philanthropy, and you grew up with this idea that everyone in the US understands philanthropy. When I came here, I realized that students have never in their life had before, even though they get scholarships, even though they benefit from, they have no conception. So I'm already happy if they leave my class and can tell me a foundation is.
Okay. Let me open it up for questions now. Shannon, you were in my line of sight, and then I'll go here. We'll take it from there.
Hey, Shannon, you've got a mic right there.
And if you could please share your name.
Shannon Kenny. Clinton School of Public Service, second-year graduate student, and fascinating lecture and Q&A. I'd like to zoom out even further as one of Dean Soto's students in her policy development class. She has taught us explicitly to study the past, learn from it, so that we can understand better the present, and then aim for a future that is the more beautiful world we know is possible to change hearts and minds. How do you see, based on everything you have seen, our current political climate, the very fact that students don't necessarily understand where their scholarships come from? Where is philanthropy going?
I'm a historian. Where philanthropy is going? Philanthropy has always been in conflict with the state, whether it is the United States, whether it is European countries, because philanthropy, and from a historical perspective, let me be absolutely clear about this. We talk about the state leaving space to philanthropy, but sometimes it's taken to understand that philanthropy is, or misunderstood, is a creation of a state. And from a historical point of view, we need to keep in mind that philanthropy came before the modern state. And philanthropy has done things the state later took over and managed better in many prospects. What seems to be a constant in American society is this really complicated relationship between philanthropy and the state. As I said, in the 19th century we have these laws which limited the transfer of funds from donors to philanthropy. In the 20th century we are not only having these congressional investigations, 2 of them without any result, the third one with the Tax Act of 1969. But when we look into the 1990s, 2000s, it continues. Lawmakers on both sides always suggests, let's tax the big rich colleges, let's tax philanthropy. I mean, there are these ideas. Even the Trump Tax Act includes this penalty on what was the rule on universities which have a certain endowment on per 500 students or so. So philanthropy is always seen as something, let's take it, let's limit it, let's do something to it. But it is little appreciated in terms of what is the contribution of that to American society. And I don't see an end to that relationship.
Right here?
Thank you. My name is Kay Lundgren, and I was curious about the topic, so I'm not affiliated with, I'm retired, basically. So if I'm a billionaire, can't I give to a charity and bypass all these concerns? And what would be the benefit of a charity versus a philanthropic interest?
So one of the options which have come up in the 20th century is the Cleveland Community Foundation, Cleveland Community Foundation, which also tried to avoid that issue of eternity and the settling on a specific goal, because if you give to that community foundation, then you have no power or limited power in determining what that money is used for. That is one way out. But when you give to an institution in which you basically enter as a person without a name, it's the community foundation. And again, people want to be remembered, and they want to be remembered for the longest possible time. That means that it should be named after them, and that explains why attempts such as this had some success, but a limited one.
Hi, I'm Nicola Driver. I'm one of the faculty members here at the Clinton School. I'm also an evaluator, so I'm really interested in how nonprofits and foundations use data to sort of measure their success. And I'm just curious, from a historical standpoint, from your perspective, how has philanthropy done that? And just kind of historically.
Okay, now I'm speechless. You managed. I don't know. That is a question I can't answer, and I'm not sure how foundations have, of course they have collected data, and I mean, I'm always grateful to the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Archive Center because they are so open about it, but they are not the norm. I mean, most foundations keep secrets with regards to what they do. So, yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Dr. Williams?
So, again, a couple of decades ago, similar situation happened in Germany, and I was in attending a couple of conferences where you had practitioners, where you had donors, where you had politicians, scientists discussing exactly these questions. And these conferences were fascinating because everyone was talking about the need of philanthropy to basically step up and to do what it is, and these donors were sitting on the stage and were shaking their head and saying, at one point, one of them just said, "Stop, it's enough now," because the expectations are just overwhelming. If we look at just at the last 200 years, philanthropy cannot, in no context, in no country, fulfill these expectations of just catching up where the states left off. That's not reasonable. And financially and logistically also simply not possible.
I'm going to interject one quick question while Bob gets the mic over to Dr. Shotang. You mentioned that there are two facets that are uniquely American. The first being the limited duration, and the second, grant making. And the only example I can think of an organization that was originally based, I believe, on an endowment was what was previously known as the Kaiser Family Foundation, but that is now KFF and does not make any grants, but produces research and creates a public good in terms of healthcare policy. Is that the exception that confirms the rule, or are there other organizations that have either started in that vein or have shifted to saying, we've got this money, instead of giving it out, we're going to plant the flag on X, Y, or Z?
I'm not entirely sure, because I'm not entirely sure that there are many foundations which move basically from one to the other. The big example is always Rockefeller, who creates this Rockefeller Foundation as a perpetual foundation, and the General Education Board as a limited one, a grant-making one. Both are grant-makings, but one limited. So he keeps them separate. Changing from one to the other is not something, there's not an example I can think of.
KFF stands out as one of those, but thank you.
Here. I'm teaching global development this semester, and in the context of global development, I would like to know, how did you see philanthropic organizations set up priorities to countries or sector so far? How did they set priorities to any countries? How they decide which countries or which sectors they are going to do their job?
So now I have to pull that historian's card and say that I'm more familiar with, more comfortable in the distant past. And let me put it this way. Philanthropic institutions make the same mistakes governments make when it comes to global aid, to development aid. And one of the fascinating stories is always about Rockefeller Foundation engagement, first in China, then in Nigeria. In both cases, Rockefeller Foundation supported the development of medical programs, medical schools, training of doctors. And as one director of a Rockefeller Foundation freely admitted, the engagement in China was an unmitigated disaster because of the very limited impact the Rockefeller Foundation had. They created Beijing Medical School, which trained a tiny amount of doctors for a country which needed a much larger supply. The fascinating thing is that when the Rockefeller Foundation embarked on a similar project about 5 decades later in Nigeria, University of Ibadan, they learned from their mistakes. And they knew that in large countries where there is an enormous need with regards to medical practitioners, you need to make sure that you don't train doctors basically for the lead of a country, but doctors who go into community medicine and serve the broad population. And so this foundation was able to learn from these mistakes. Again, I have my doubts that that would apply to many foundations, but here we have one of these really fascinating cases. So mistakes like this are always made, whether it is a foundation, whether it is a government. The problem is not making mistakes, the problem is admitting mistakes, learning from it, and then do it better the next time.
My name is Wes Pruitt. I am a alum of the Clinton School, graduated in 2019, class 13. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the rise of corporate foundations as opposed to family foundations, where that came from, if that's uniquely American.
Yeah, so this is one of the points I did not include in my remarks because of a 10-minute limit, but this idea of mixing private companies, marketplace with nonprofits, foundations is not a new phenomenon. That started already in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it had a different name. It was called Philanthropy and 5%. So there was this notion that you do something good, but you still have some kind of financial interest in it. It starts not in the United States, but in the UK, in London, actually in the space of the provision of social housing. 19th century urbanization, housing problem is the biggest issue at the time, and donors realized that with traditional philanthropy, the creation of housing foundations, housing trusts, there was no way to battle that. So they looked for alternatives to make this project more attractive to traditional businessmen who basically came into this not for the purpose of philanthropy, but for limited, but still for profit. And that, in the case of London, was the basis for the creation of a very large number of social housing companies, which we today would not describe as social housing companies because they included that moment of profit. That model appealed to donors across the globe. We find these institutions 20, 30 years later, not just in the United States, but also in Canada, in Japan, across the European continent. And that is the basis for this profit-oriented philanthropy, which in the second half of the 19th century, this is before Rockefeller, before these big foundations, is the dominating form of philanthropy in the Western world. In the first half of the 20th century, that form got more or less forgotten, and it is only in the last 2 or 3 decades that this notion of combining profit-oriented companies with non-profit companies comes back into shape. So again, a historical approach will help you understand that none of these ideas are actually new. They have precedent.
We are at time, but I would like to ask one last question. Dr. Adam, you have a magic wand. You are approached by one of these overnight Silicon Valley billionaires to form a foundation with an endowment. What would be one piece of advice that you would give to them in terms of ensuring they maximized their impact and that impact for as long as possible was true to their original intent?
Based on the research and my own interest, I would tell whoever has these ideas should create a foundation that benefits higher education. The biggest problem in the United States is tuition. And that is a problem self-inflicted and a rather recent problem. So any kind of foundation which would help creating, call it tuition waivers, whatever there is, I would give that advice. That would be very helpful.
I promise I did not put him up to that answer. I promise you. I could not agree more. It was a joy to have you here at the Clinton School. I hope this is not your last time visiting us. Yes, and thank you all for joining us, spending a little bit of your day. Thank you to Dr. Charlotte Williams for opening us up and her work in community philanthropy. Have a great rest of the day.